Okay, he's off.
Presentation, you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands in the chat and pose the question there, and you'll be given the option to either pose the question yourself, or I will do so in the Q&A at the end of the session on your behalf. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. Philip Ingram, who is our main speaker running the presentation, is a former British military intelligence officer, a widely published journalist, specializing in security and intelligence, but he runs his own media company, Hare Media. So whilst with the army, amongst other things, he controlled HM UINT operations and counter-intelligence operations, hacking people and looking for hacked people. So basically, he's rooted in cyber, so no one better than him to lead this discussion. We also have Ghonche Alavi, who is an information and network security advisor at Crisis 24. She's an experienced information and network security advisor and a certified ISO 27001 professional, certified digital forensics examiner, and an ethical hacker registered with the International Cybersecurity Institute. We're also joined by Ryan Rubin, who is a senior managing director at Ingram and a cybersecurity advisor and investigator. He brings 23 years experience of global before and boutique companies to help clients holistically manage complex cyber and threat challenges from the boardroom to the network. And finally, Dan Or-Hof, who we thank for joining us literally in the last 24 hours, replacing his colleague Eliaf, who unfortunately is unwell. Dan is a respected lawyer in the field of technology, the founder of Or-Hof, technology and IP law firm. He is a university lecturer and former head of an international Israeli-based law firm's IT, internet, and copyright department. So he has an intimate knowledge of the technology and innovation industry. So those are speakers. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. It's a real honor to have you with us. And we look forward to hearing your presentations and to having a brief Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll pass on the floor to Philip so that he can start the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Mark, thank you very much indeed. And it's very kind of you to invite me to talk to with this esteemed panel and to such a strong audience. I put a definition up of the insider threat on my first slide. And whilst people are reading that, I'm sure most people know it. But I was in a previous incarnament, one of the worst people that you could get from an insider threat perspective, because as a British military intelligence officer, I used to recruit people to work as agents inside different organizations so that they could pass me things that those organizations wouldn't want necessarily to be passed. That is probably the most dangerous type of insider that you can get, more of which later. Next slide, please. So I'm starting off with a quote from a fantastic lady. If you don't know her, she's just brought out a new book, Dr. Jessica Barker. We look at the cyber threat too often as a technological issue, but we have to remember that it always starts in the physical world with someone physically doing something, whether it's coding or something else, and it ends up in an effect happening in the physical world as well. So two questions that I want to ask at the very beginning. How much emphasis does your cyber team put on people when you're looking at threats? And a little test, because let's assume that we're in the boardroom at the moment and we're having a very closed discussion that we don't want to go out anywhere. I'm currently hacking the system and this presentation in a way that it will never leave a trace on your networks. And I'll be interested to see how many people pick up how that is happening. Next slide, please. So we know how complex the cyber threat landscape is. And I put this up here just to show that complexity and emphasize it. There's a few red boxes around areas where people come into it and work their way through. And we hear the terms of phishing and social engineering and everything else, but it comes down to the basics whenever we're looking at the threats to our networks and the way that we can deal with them. And the first question in that is, do you understand, do your people understand your and their digital exposures? And in dealing with the insider threat, and I'd expand this to dealing with wider cyber issues or any security issues, it's as much about knowing your people and the culture in the organization that you're in as it is about a technological solution at any time. Next slide, please. So some of the figures, and it's very easy to get lots of different figures showing how bad everything is that's out there, and how many millions of dollars each attack is going to cost your company. And it constantly surprises me when we hear of companies being breached, or we see that there's cyber attacks going on in a company that you know, and it actually doesn't cost them very much money at all. But some of the stats that have come out, and these are from the Verizon 2018 Data Breach Investigation Report, perpetrated by outsiders, you can see 73%. Internal actors, so the people that we're looking at today, 28%. Partners, your supply chain, anyone that's connected into your network, a relatively small number there. But organized crime, by far one of the biggest statistics, but don't forget the nation state or nation state actors, and I'll touch on that towards the end. But the largest area of cybersecurity compromises are caused by human behavior. It's humans that have done something wrong somewhere. And the biggest digital problem that there tends to be, and I hope you can see this, is that digit, and it's that digit pressing a button or clicking on something that it shouldn't be doing. Next slide, please. So 2 slides of statistics just to go through it quickly, so that you can get the flavor for where this sits. 88% of UK companies have suffered breaches in the last 12 months. Those breaches under the General Data Protection Regulation should be reported to the Information Commissioner and investigated, and if they're not reported, that's an automatic breach of the General Data Protection Regulation, just reminding people of that. However, we're slightly lower statistically than Germany, France, and Italy. One small business hacked every 19 seconds in the UK. That's a bit of a shocking one. There have been physical hacks happening in the City of London since we've gone into close down, where there have been more physical burglaries that have been started. And a friend of mine is the Commissioner of the City of London Police, and he says it's been great for his arrest statistics, because the burglars didn't realize that by breaking into the buildings, the fact that there was nobody in there apart from a few security guards didn't make it easier for them, because when they left the buildings, the only people that were in the streets were the burglars, and with their swag bags over their shoulders, they got arrested by the City of London Police, who were bored because there was no one else around, arrested very quickly and taken away. Just a little aside, but the statistics that we're seeing in here for cyber attacks, and they are continuing through this, are significant. Next slide, please. And that talks into costs. Costs, because it's internationalizing, it's been put into US dollars in looking at it, and these have come from a number of different well-accepted reports, you know, IBM and Ponemon's cost of data breach studies. The biggest cost that there is to any organization, and the numbers we can argue over, but the biggest cost to any organization is that reputational cost that comes in, and it's that reputational cost that tends to affect customer loyalty or customer retention or ability to recruit new customers, and that's the bit that is the hardest thing for you to get back again at any time. And the numbers, as I say, they're from different reports. You can look at them. I don't get het up on numbers, but it shows that it's significant. The main takeaways from this are the effects it has on your reputation and the effect that that has on retaining customers, retaining loyalty, and being able to generate new ones. There's some companies that I know of that are in the business sphere that I know I will never take up their their offers because they've had significant breaches in the past, and you just get that inbuilt mistrust. And next slide, please. So another couple of questions to think about. And I'm sure everyone's read those. So next slide, please. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you for inviting me for this great webinar. I appreciate it, and hello to everyone. You know, my job is not to tell you what you cannot do. That's the easy part. I think that the more interesting part is what you can do and how you should do it. So when we're talking about workplace-related cyber threats, fraud-related threats, when you need to handle them, when you need to cope with them, you need some form of monitoring activities, monitoring your information systems, your telecommunications, your physical offices. And when you're talking about monitoring activity, inevitably you're monitoring the behavior of your employees, and that inevitably leads to privacy issues. So Philip mentions the General Data Protection Regulation, which is of course extremely relevant in the case of deploying anti-fraud, anti-cyber measures in the workplace. Now, so this is the basis, the basic foundation of what a company should take into consideration when it's making its steps toward tackling cybersecurity related inside information, inside risks. Next slide, please. So essentially there are, and I'll talk about the four main principles that you need to be aware of. But first, a couple of notes from a more practical perspective. When we're talking about workplace monitoring and in general privacy related, data protection related compliance, there are two main aspects that are extremely dominant in doing the relevant compliance work. First is assessment. You need to assess the risk involved, the measures, the harm to individuals, to employees as a result of deploying your measures. This is something that is extremely abundant in many of the GDPR requirements, including in relation to the workplace environment. And the other is documentation. You need to demonstrate your compliance. You need to record and document the processes that you're doing. So you need to put in place in paper what you're doing. So the accumulation of assessment and the documentation for the purpose of demonstrating your compliance is crucial, is extremely important. So there are four basic principles that you need to be minded to. First of all, is the necessity. Do I really, is there a real necessity for deploying a certain monitoring measures, whether it be, for example, data leak prevention measures, user behavior analytics, or any other type of monitoring type of measures? Can I record the telephone calls of my employees? Can I access their emails on an automated process or manually? These are all questions that the basic foundation is the necessity assessment. Do I really need to do it? For example, if we're talking about, just as an example, to set an example, if I want to deploy a fraud prevention type of measure, and for example, I've been hit by a fraudulent activity during the past year, that would probably provide you with the right legitimacy to use this type of measure. However, if the fraud activity happened 5 or 10 years ago, then you will need to look for additional legitimacy, additional reasons in order to deploy the measures, such as looking for other similar companies, whether they were hit by fraudulent activities as well, suspicious behaviors that has a fraudulent pattern. This is another factor that you can take into consideration. Are there any alarming warnings that you received from your clients or from your vendors? These are all aspects that you can consider while assessing the legitimacy or the necessity of deploying a monitoring measure. The legitimacy talks about the lawful ground. We need a lawful ground. The General Data Protection, which was enacted as the UK Data Protection Act, essentially provides 6 lawful grounds of processing. And let me start by saying that the most popular lawful ground for processing data about individuals, and processing data meaning monitoring their behavior as well, is consent. But consent in workplace environment is a no-go. You cannot really base your processing, your monitoring activity on the consent of the employees. This is already published as an opinion by both the ICO, the Information Commissioner in the UK, and the regulators in the EU. So consent is not an option. There are other lawful grounds which are more relevant, and in particular, what the GDPR calls the legitimate interest. You need to weigh your workplace, your employer's legitimate interest to tackle fraudulent activities, cybersecurity threats, etc., and balance them with the rights and freedoms of your employees, and especially their right to privacy and to their autonomy. So it's not enough to show a sort of a vital interest of the workplace in order to deploy the measure. You need, as I said, you need to to strike the right balance between the measures and the needs and the rights of your employees. The third aspect is the proportionality. After you've decided that there's an actual necessity for a measure and there's a lawful ground, which is essentially in most cases the legitimate interests of the company, you need to be proportionate, meaning that you need to do the necessary minimum. That's the focus that the regulation is aiming you. Meaning, for example, if you're talking about deployment of CCTVs, then you need to deploy the minimum necessary cameras in your offices. That's just to set an example. So proportionality is an extremely important measure in order not to identify the right measure, but rather after you've identified the measure, to decide how do you deploy it with the minimum harm and still achieve your goals to tackle the risks that you've identified. And the fourth factor is the transparency. You simply cannot hide it. Employees need to know about monitoring activities in the workplace. They need to know it mostly in writing. Workplaces, companies, employers need to put things down in writing in a manner that the average employee would understand. A general policy known as, for example, the acceptable use policy or a workplace privacy policy. You need to put in place in details the actual measures that you're taking in order to tackle and to prevent cybersecurity threats and fraudulent activities, etc. And so the employees would actually know what they should expect in terms of monitoring their behavior. Okay, next slide, please. So just a couple more specific details, and I just set an example when about an employer wanting to either record telephone calls of employees, to access email messages, or to deploy a camera. So essentially, as I said, you need to have a legal basis. You need to conduct an actual assessment. We'll talk about it maybe a little bit later, what's called the Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA. That's something that you need to do before you deploy the actual measure. You need to set the grounds for the right balance between the measure and the harm to the privacy of your employees as a result. You need to identify the retention times, the exact retention times, for example, of the CCTV footage. You cannot just simply keep it forever. You need to think about the security measures, the access, those personnel who have access. And again, you need to keep it to the minimum. There's no need for a prior notification. There's no need for prior notification and to the information, to the ICO, to the Information Commissioner, and no need for approval and no need for consent. So these are generally the basic rules for all three aspects of monitoring. Yes, we've arranged sort of a poll. So if you can present, Mark, Julie, if we could present the questions, let's go over these questions. So the first question would be, can an employer record an employee's phone call? So first answer, yes, even if the employee's consent, even without the employee's consent, if the purpose is to detect a crime or an unauthorized use of the company's phone system, yes, but only if the employee provided a prior consent. Yes, even without the employee's consent, if the purpose is to detect a crime. And the fourth is recording an employee's phone call is an unlawful interception of communication. So what would be the right answer in your view? Okay, until we get the answer, I think we have a question from Brian. The use of open source information on employees, e.g. obtained from social media in penetration tests to test vulnerabilities to social engineering. So essentially the answer is generally yes, but you need to know that this is a country-specific type of legislation and regulation. There are countries who are more stringent on these matters and prohibit, for example, attaining information about criminal records or past criminal history of employees and other individuals. So this is something that you need to look into depending on the territory, the jurisdictions that you're in. Essentially, generally speaking, looking under UK laws, looking for information on publicly available sources. This is something that was debated in the past and was tried to be prevented in some cases, but it's still possible and optional for employers. So do we have the results for the first question? Okay, well, it seems that I've managed to fool you. Okay, so we have 29% for the first, 32 for the second, 29 for the third, and 11 for the fourth. So the answer to this question is yes, you can record employees' phone call. That's under the Investigatory Powers Act and regulations. If you're conducting this type of records for the purpose of detecting a crime or an unauthorized use of the company's telecommunications. So that would be answer A. The other answers are of course false. We can go over to the next question. If you can scroll down, please. Or I can do that. Or we already have the answers for the next question. Okay, you were absolutely right. So an employer can access the workplace emails when the access is necessary for the employer's legitimate interest. As I said, you need to conduct some sort of an assessment and balance, weigh in both the necessity, the needs on one hand, and the employee's rights to privacy on the other hand, and you need to provide a notice. You cannot do it without providing a notice to your employees. And so, and the third question, what are the conditions for installing CCTV lawfully? And again, I think that most of you got it right. The employer must evaluate the necessity and proportionality of using CCTV. Exactly, that would be the right question, the right answer. Okay, thank you very much for all of you that answered the poll. Just one note about sensitive data. So the GDPR, the data protection regulation, differentiates between, so to speak, regular data and sensitive data, what's called special categories of data. It's extremely relevant, I think, in relation to at least two types of very popular use in workplaces, and that relates to biometric data. Biometric data is a special category, and it's often used for example, to fingerprint access to your to the offices, and some companies are using face recognition systems in conjunction with their CCTV. So biometric data, sensitive data in general, requires explicit consent from the employees, and that means that an explicit consent requires a genuine choice by the employees. You need to provide a genuine alternative for the employee, and the employee can revoke consent. So before you deploy any type of biometric related monitoring system in your workplace, it calls for a separate and in-depth assessment. So next slide, please, just to wrap it up. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so just to wrap it up, what you need to do. The first is prepare the necessary notices, either an acceptable use policy or a workplace privacy policy. Put down in writing exactly what your employees can and cannot do on your information systems, and provide details about your monitoring activities. Conduct the DPIAs, the impact assessments. This is a necessity, a must, and record them in order to demonstrate that you're doing things right. Create your own internal procedures, the assessments, as I mentioned, a retention policy, data retention policy, a CCTV policy, a proper security policy to handle the security and monitoring measures. And if you're using vendors for these purposes, you should look out to see how they are conducting their work. It's your responsibility. So you need to make sure that they're handling and processing and securing the data properly. That's it. Thank you very much. Philip, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Dan, thank you very much indeed. That it always amazes me with the General Data Protection Regulation being a European-wide regulation, how every country in Europe seems to interpret the way it is translated into local privacy laws and everything else in a slightly different way. But I'm sure we can pick that up in questions at the end. Next slide, please. So for people that are watching in, are insider threats occurring today? Is it happening to you? Well, you can see the date on the tweet that went out from one of Elon Musk's gigafactories in the United States, 27th of August. Earlier in August, an employee of the gigafactory had been approached by an old colleague who just happened to be Russian. And they went out drinking for the evening, and during that evening he was approached and offered $500,000 to put some software into the network system inside the Gigafactory. The employee did the right thing and reported it, and the Russian got arrested by the FBI. But it shows that there are deliberate insider threats happening today. And if you think that it's not happening inside your organization, I'm afraid you're wrong. It is. Next slide, please. The majority of insider threats are accidental. And there are really two types. There's the compromised, and that's the employee who picks up a USB stick at an expo or something else, and that USB stick has got a bit of malware on it, and they take it into work and put it into a work computer to try and see what's on it and look at it and accidentally infect the network. Hopefully your network monitoring systems will be able to pick that sort of thing up. The biggest threat of an insider is the careless insider. So someone who is rushing around and clicking on things a little bit too quickly and not checking to see whether it's what they'd expect to see, but it can even catch the most alert people out. A friend of mine is Chief Information Security Officer of a large financial institute. He had organized a red team to come in and try and carry out a spear phishing attack on senior executives within his business. The red team came in. He was busy that morning clicking through things. His phone had gone off, his emails were going in. He opened an email as he was talking to a phone on his phone, trying to check something else on his iPad, and clicked on the link in the email because he thought he knew who it had come from. It was the red teaming team that he had instructed to come into his company. He was the first victim. So it can happen to anyone. Education is key in that. The more dangerous ones are the deliberate attacks, and they fall into two real categories. The deliberate self-motivated, so you've got a disgruntled or malicious employee, a disgruntled former employee, or a contractor, someone who's got access into your networks somewhere. Or those that are being deliberately manipulated either for money, for revenge, are being blackmailed into it, or for some other reason. Next slide, please. And the types of attack that we're getting are, there's active and passive. I'm carrying out one of those at the moment. The active, stealing something, damaging something, manipulating something, doing something physically within the network or within the company. Not all of this has to happen inside the network. People will still have paper files. People will still have paper copies of things that could be copied somewhere else. That is an insider threat and could compromise data. Passive, watching and reporting. A spy within your organization who is just monitoring everything that's going on and talking to people out and building a picture up over a period of time. Some of the indicators that you have to start to look at, and I'll expand on these a little bit more in a moment. The capability, does someone have the capability to commit an attack? Well, anyone who's got access to what on your system has the capability, and therefore access control, who can access what areas of your network are critically important. Is someone motivated to do it? And we'll look at motives in a moment. And then an opportunity to commit an attack. So that could be an indicator as to the sort of person that could be acting as an insider. Next slide, please. Another example, FBI were having a conference call with the UK Serious and Organised Crime Agency. They had liaison officers coming into the call from the Irish Gardaí as they were looking at various things. They were focusing on a wider strategy to deal with the anonymous activist group. Shortly after the conference call, a recording of the call was posted on the anonymous website. How did it happen? There was an Irish Gardaí officer who didn't want to go into the office to get the call. He'd forwarded the call details to a Gmail account, not realizing that his personal Gmail account had already been compromised by Anonymous, and they just logged in themselves and recorded the whole meeting without anyone knowing about it. Easy to do, an accidental insider threat, an accidental insider compromise, but with potentially very severe consequences. The Gardaí officer knew that what he was doing, he was violating his policy, culture, a culture of in an organization of where people are allowed to get away with that, or feel as if they can get away with it, and they're self-empowered to do that. And culture is an important piece. Next slide, please. So what are the things to look for? I'll put them out as lots of little balls that are out there. There's things that could be triggers. It doesn't necessarily say they will be triggers. So someone passed over for promotion, someone looking for a new job, someone who regularly has security violations, someone in a sensitive area who is not of the nation where that the sensitive material is being handled, someone who is trying always to get more access, more admin rights onto the system. People who work unusual working hours, who come in very early in the morning or who go home very late at night, they don't want to be in a position where they get watched. All of a sudden, one of your employees turns up in his brand new Ferrari or Maserati, and you know that his salary wouldn't do that. Looking at employees' social media, someone who is being more vocal and outspoken on their social media posts, family issues, unreported foreign travel. There's lots of bits that could indicate that someone is in a potential position either to be compromised or are unhappy with what's going on in the company. And the sorts of thing to start to look for then as indicators are what I put as behavioral clusters, where you're getting a group of these coming together. So say alcohol abuse, poor performance in an appraisal when you've had an outstanding employee for a period of time, recent family issues, potential divorce. And you're looking for all of these with all of the tools you've got across your organization to try and detect insiders who can pose a risk, to deal with those issues and mitigate the risks before that individual turns into an insider and an insider threat. Next slide, please. So hardening your organization, I would argue, is from the insider threat. And whilst we're talking about this in a cyber security conference, it's not the responsibility of the IT department. It is responsibility of everyone within the company, everyone in a management position, and is as much an HR issue as it is an IT issue. And the best forms of defense for dealing with insiders are what I call a cultural defense. Know your people, engage with them frequently, look out for warning signs, encourage a culture of sharing so that you can pick up anyone who is not doing what they usually did, or their behaviors changed, or something else has happened, and have a reporting blameless culture. So if someone, with the majority threats being accidental, if someone has clicked on a link accidentally, instead of them trying to cover it all up and everything else, it's much better if they put their hand up very quickly and say, look, I'm really sorry, I was really busy, I did this, I clicked in this, can we check it, so you can mitigate against any potential risk into your networks and data compromise before it happens. If you don't have that culture, and that's a cultural thing, the danger is people try and hide it, and that's when your networks can be compromised for long periods of time. Technical helps that are out there, of course, that can enhance it. Remove unneeded default accounts, change passwords on default accounts, strong passwords, 2 or 3 factor authentication, disable all unneeded services, enable logging, as Dan mentioned. But with all of it, the underlying piece that I'd put is education, education, education. Make sure everyone in your workforce and your management structure is educated in the potential threats that are out there, and use that to try and build that cultural piece. Next slide, please. A couple of unusual ones that I'm just going to touch on and leave them out there. I'm not going into any great detail, but it's not just about your network. The example that I used in the Tesla Gigafactory, the 3 individuals that you see on the screen there all have slightly different desires whenever they get their teams working into your network. Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader in the top right, his hacking teams are after cryptocurrency. As much of it as they can get, they use that for their international trade, breaking sanctions. Vladimir Putin, in the middle, his teams will do things out of badness. They're after more political secrets. They're after compromat that they can get. They were the ones trying to get into the gigafactories, so they're after business-related secrets as well. And Xi Jinping and the Chinese in the bottom left, they are principally after intellectual property, so that they can try and get one step ahead of the game within the business environment. But all 3 of them will use their military and national capabilities to try and enhance their nation-specific positions, and that's going to be very, very, very difficult to defend against. questions to ask on that. Who else is in your company within there? And do you have staff that travel? And if they travel to China or Russia with the same IT that they're working on your networks with, you have been compromised 100%. You need to be careful and seek advice very quickly. Next slide, please. The other area that's growing and fits into cyber in a way, but doesn't quite sit within anything within a company, but is something that can hurt your reputation in a very big way, is the use of information as a weapon. So you see a lot of the fake news that's going around, and I'm sure most people have seen fake news with 5G. The master of the use of deception and fake news is Vladimir Putin, which is why I've got his picture there, but it's nothing new. The Second World War, excuse the letters that have dropped, but Operation Fortitude was the Allies convincing the Germans that the invasion into Europe was going to come through the Pas de Calais, not in through Normandy, and that worked extremely well. That used fake news, that used deception, that used everything else that's out there. But what's the impact of fake news or something that is not quite accurate being put around by one of your employees or one of your senior employees on their own personal or on the corporate social media accounts that are out there, and how could that potentially impact your reputation? This is something that is growing increasingly important, and reputational damage is one of the areas that causes some of the biggest financial damage to different companies. So again, this is something that needs to be part of any policies that you're looking at in dealing with, and education that you're looking at in dealing with this particular threat. Next slide, please. Ryan, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, both Phil and Dan. It's been really insightful listening in on both of your perspectives, and it makes my life a lot easier. This is the only slide I have, but you've certainly provided a huge, a great backdrop to what I can share. So I guess just to kind of pick up on Phil's point, one of the big challenges we all have out there is it's almost impossible to stop people, committing cyber attacks, and there are various ways in which this can be done. Whilst there's an increased awareness of good security practices, evolution of security technologies to help, it isn't kind of, we haven't solved the problem or fully cracked the nut yet. But one thing that the industry has been shifting and pivoting on around tackling this is taking more control over the defensive side of security. Whilst we cannot prevent the attackers coming in, we certainly can do quite a lot to make their life a little bit harder, make them jump through several hoops in order to achieve their objectives. And this is something that is within our control, and something that a lot of organizations are starting to think about. But I still think there's quite a lot of work to do in this space. The other thing is, and it was Sun Tzu made this comment a long time ago: know your enemy and know yourself. And if you do so, you can feel safe and confident going into battle. And Philip has mentioned a couple of concepts around who the enemy might be, and some of the threat actors that we have from a nation state point of view. And there are also lots of those kind of enemies that might be, again, staff that are making the wrong decisions. Sometimes they've been put under pressure. Sometimes they're just making mistakes. And each of these different types of dimensions can ultimately lead to the same outcome, which could, again, be the loss of data. It could be disruption of your business, etc. So again, we can't necessarily control what the nation states are going to be thinking about doing. I think we generally have a good idea of the direction, and Philip went into quite a lot of detail on that with specific actors. So we kind of have an idea of what they're doing. We kind of also know the typical techniques that they're using, and that can help us design the right response to those types of things. But again, knowing ourselves is so key to this. And again, I'm often asked, well, which technologies do I need to put in to manage my insider threats? To what technology should I buy to protect my websites? And how should I respond to security, cyber risk, security risk management? And the first thing I go to is, well, think about your own business. What is it that you've got to lose? Okay, is it the reputation? Is it that you have a secret recipe that perhaps, in the Gigafactory case, maybe the Russians were after? Is it that there's certain parts of your business that, if disrupted, are going to cause a major impact to yourselves or potentially to third parties or customers, or even people that you might supply services to? And understanding that the answer to those questions helps you to define the right approach to managing your risks, and specifically from an insider threat perspective. Here we are thinking about data that might be leaked. We're thinking about employees that could be disgruntled, that might want to do some harm, or again external people that may want to get access to these insiders in order to carry out the various attacks and so on. So that educational piece is also really key, because often people are the weakest link in security, and they're the ones that everybody's going after. So with all of this in mind, I guess I'll share a couple of technologies and types of technologies that I'm seeing, helping in this space. People process technology, really important in that order. I think Dan's point about the legal right for you to be able to use some of these technologies is key, because often we'll go in, we'll help an organization run an RFP process to decide on an insider threat technology. They buy the technology, and then there's kind of, well, can we actually use this? And where can we use it? And how can we use it? What processes need to be in place in order to use it correctly? So a lot of these things need to happen before one even brings technology into the picture. But the good news is that there are some great technologies out there. There's no silver bullet. But again, I've been in the industry for many years now, and the type of toys that are out there, the flashing lights and wonderful things, really get us in the technology world very excited. But there are feasible solutions that many years ago just wouldn't have worked. So we can actually log our data. We can provide some automation in the form of artificial intelligence and machine learning that can actually help to analyze the data that we are recording, if we're allowed to record them. We can look at the concept of behavioral monitoring. So, if we know that certain users access certain applications, or certain systems communicate with other systems, and we can do a profile of that, we can start to look through the noise and see specific trends in behavior, in activities that might lead us to the potential for there being an insider threat or an insider activity. We have things like firewalls, two-factor and three-factor authentication. These things have become affordable. So there's no excuse why a company cannot go out and offer two-factor authentication, because we have things like this, which is hidden in the green screen, and it's become affordable to send those second factors or third factors to people's phones, so that even if a hacker gets in, even if they've got a password, they still need to have a device, or they still need to have something else before they're allowed to get access to sensitive systems. We have the concept of EDR technology, endpoint detection and response technology, which helps us tremendously when we're doing an investigation, because and containing an incident, because we're able to take control of the endpoints and quickly boot an insider out of the network as soon as we know that something funny is going on. We can also provide a huge amount of granular access and monitoring of processes and systems that are running on those devices. And once again, in the old days, this technology was hard to play. There was lots of risks associated with it. Whereas today, there are companies like Carbon Black, Tenable, Titanium, and CrowdStrike, and others that are making this this kind of technology more accessible. Threat hunting, we spoke a little bit about red teaming. There's blue teaming and purple teaming. These are all proactive exercises companies can put in place to actively assume that your organization has been breached, and look into see what kind of patterns and behaviors are out there that can help provide an early sign of potential challenges. We also have this massive move into the cloud as well, and that is creating its own set of challenges. But through deployment of resources in the cloud, that creates an additional barrier and an additional monitoring point for us, so that we can actually see all the communications that are coming in and out of the cloud instance. We can generate a whole lot of monitoring activity which sits in the cloud, which can then be analyzed and automated, and I think actually can make life a lot easier if done in the right way. And again, that does introduce extra risks. So those cloud providers have insiders that are administering those cloud environments, and we need to take appropriate measures like using appropriate levels of encryption, to lock people out of having access to certain types of data. DLP. So, this is a big topic to help data leakage prevention. Again, in a traditional world, this has been quite hard for companies to implement. We've seen companies like Microsoft and through Office 365 having built-in DLP capabilities for outgoing email. And once again, this is something that is becoming a lot more accessible than it ever was. So I do think that overall and in summary, there's quite a lot of technology that is out there that we can start to use. We need to use it in the right way. It needs to be very focused. It needs to be part of a much wider campaign, as Philip and Dan have discussed. Yeah, it's something that definitely needs to be considered and brought into the overall insider threat management program. I think I'll leave it at that, and perhaps I'll give you some examples later on. I know there is some Q&A that's coming up at the end. So thank you very much.
Ryan, thank you very much indeed. And next slide, please, because we're looking at how do you stop identifying an attack. What are the sorts of things that you can do? I've mentioned them the whole way through. Culture and education are the biggest things. Limit access, strong policies. But in your policies, what have I been hacking the system with? Sitting in my top pocket with the camera facing the screen, I've got authorization to look and view at the data that I have on my screen. I've been broadcasting that outside to someone over my mobile phone. Don't forget your mobile phone policies. That's one of the best espionage devices that exists at the moment. Audio and video recording and broadcast at the same time. And how many people just put them on the desk in the conference room in front of them and nobody pays attention to them. So make sure your policies are properly strong, and with those policies, write contingency plans, but exercise and practice those contingency plans so you know what to do in the case of a breach. You know what to do through various scenarios if you identify potential insider threats. And within those policies and those contingency plans, you get your messaging right, because reputation is one of the biggest risks. You need to be able to get your messaging out to your customers, to your employees, to everyone else once you've become aware of a potential breach, so you can minimize its impact. And now I think it's over to you, Ghonche. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Philip. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you for having me here today. If I could just ask for the final poll to be published so you can see the question that's posed, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So the question is, has anybody here on the call today been a victim of fraud or cybercrime? And if you're comfortable to share some of the details of that, please feel free to share it in the chat box, and we'll come back to it at the end. If we move on to the next slide while you all take a vote on that, I'll quickly run through, from my perspective, working in crisis management, what is an effective response and recovery. So from a cyber incident response perspective, the most effective recovery is very much grounded in your crisis management approach. And that involves standing up a crisis management team, which includes a range of key stakeholders from across the business. Typically HR, legal, operations will all be included on that, as well as others from the C-suite. And they're effectively tasked with understanding how they can best minimize the financial, the operational, and the reputational risk to your organization following an incident. Typically, you'd want to have this group covered through legal privilege, either through in-house counsel or external legal support. But they're very much focused on understanding the facts, and then also at the same time, planning for a range of scenarios as this incident unfolds, as you get more information through the forensic investigation. And the initial assessment that's conducted is in part to understand some of the breach notifications that were discussed earlier. And conducting a data impact assessment early on as part of the prevention and pre-incident work that you should be doing will mean that you can quickly identify what is notifiable and what isn't. I was recently on a case where there was dispute between local counsel versus the international lawyers that were tasked by the CMT to provide advice. And there was conflicting advice around whether encryption of data itself warrants notification or not, whether that stands as accessing data or not. So there's a lot of nuance in that, and therefore you really do need legal counsel. Parallel to this, of course, you're looking to identify the threat actor. Now, if it's an insider threat, they might be very well accustomed to understanding your network and your systems, your critical data, and will know where to hit you where it hurts the most. They might even know how to cover their tracks. So it might not be possible for you to understand fully what they've actually done and what data has been exfiltrated out of the organization. The crisis management team also needs to be identifying your key stakeholders from a communications perspective, because typically organizations can be doing the right things, taking the right steps, but if they forget to effectively communicate this to stakeholders, they still risk, their reputation being harmed, employees not knowing what's going on, why access has been revoked. So stakeholder mapping and analysis, if you do it in advance, of course, you'd save time, but absolutely crucial that the crisis management team take ownership of that and approve messaging that's going to be pushed out both to clients, to vendors, and employees in-house. The last point I wanted to make on crisis management is the role of law enforcement. Most organizations I work with are quite reluctant to bring law enforcement on side. And I think it's partly because they don't want to necessarily get them involved in terms of the investigation. They want to get business up and running as quickly as possible. But having law enforcement support in terms of reaching out to the intelligence community, understanding if there's any data or historic understanding of the specific breach that's affecting you can prove extremely helpful. I've seen particularly on ransomware cases where decryption tools are actually held on databases by law enforcement agencies. So definitely not one to avoid. And if we quickly move on, to just the final slide, which is around restoration, there's two key components to recovery. There's the forensic investigation, which unfortunately can be a very lengthy process. I've been on cases where it's taken weeks and weeks, if not months, to pull together all the artifacts and build a holistic timeline of what's actually happened. But from a legal perspective, you're going to want to do this, particularly if you're operating in an environment that's slightly more litigious and you just want to make sure you've checked everything off. So having a chain of custody and acquiring that data is crucial. That feeds then into the remediation plan, which the IT security team is focused on in terms of getting you up and running as quickly as possible. That involves network hardening around the specific vulnerabilities that were exploited in this incident, but also looking at the other potential vulnerabilities that had previously been missed and ensuring that you're isolating, containing the incident and taking things up online in a progressive way without actually compromising your system any further. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll stop there. I'm not sure if the poll has been published, if you can see the results. So most actually haven't been a victim of fraud and cybercrime, which is interesting because, where I operate, it seems very much that it's not if you've been hit, but it's when you'll be hit. And with that, I'll hand over back to Philip. Thank you.
I think we're going straight to questions, and Mark has got one, but I think 84% of people out there haven't realized that they've suffered as some form of cyber attack. Mark.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're running a little bit late, so I just have one question from Dr. Jackie Taylor, who is a good friend of ours, of course, one of the speakers who will be our main speakers who will be with us at CyberCon. So she's asking about AI and was questioning how the issue of consent was being discussed earlier, and that this affects the contract of employment, and AI has different regulation, even if a crime is being investigated. So AI, for example, she comments, if you're using AI, consent needs to be extended in Europe. Dan, maybe you want to comment very briefly on this so that we can close, because I'd like to finish not more than 1 minute late. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Jackie, and thank you very much for the question. I've just shared with you a quote from the Information Commissioner's Guide to Data Protection in the Workplace Environment. And essentially what the ICO is guiding is that consent in most cases would not be the relevant lawful ground of processing. Rather, it will be, and especially in cases of putting in place cybersecurity measures, the legitimate interest would probably be the main lawful ground of processing. I do agree that AI has its own evolving set of regulation. I don't know if you're referring to the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI that was published by the EU. And definitely there are some different aspects and positions about the ability to receive a genuine consent from an employee, especially in relation to monitoring or even intrusive monitoring of the employee's behavior in the workplace. So, and I did mention also that in any case, and that relates to AI-related data processing, in any case, when you're talking about sensitive data, what the GDPR calls special categories of data, you cannot rely on legitimate interests. So if the AI invokes the use of sensitive employees' information, that's where you should need to rely. You should need to be relying on consent and make sure that you receive a genuine, freely given, and unambiguous consent from your employees for that purpose.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Jackie, for your question. Any other questions, please feel free to email us and we'll make sure that we can follow up on them because we're running out of time. So, Julie, maybe we can see the last slide because I'd like to speak very briefly in less than a minute. First of all, to thank you all for joining us today. We will have another webinar in November. Details will follow. And of course, we hope to see you all in person at CyberCon conference, which will for now be held on the 9th of March, 2021. It promises to be a really new and different experience. All the speakers who you've seen today will be present. We have a number of other speakers. If you look at the website, you'll see them. We are keeping in touch with the venue and with public health requirements, because there is a chance that we might need to postpone the event in case, you know, due to the ongoing pandemic. So we are, of course, safety first, and I hope that all of you enjoyed this seminar and will, of course, keep in touch with us for the next webinar and for the conference. And thanks again, and please stay safe. And thank you, everyone on the panel. Much appreciated. It was wonderful listening to your insights, and we look forward to following up very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you very much, all. Take care. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Cheers, folks. Look forward to seeing you if we get the physical event going.
Well, we will get it going. The question is when. Today, I was very much relieved that we are able to postpone it if we have to. But it will happen. Hopefully on the 9th of March. If not, we'll let everyone know. And if anyone has bought a ticket for the 9th of March, we'll of course give them the opportunity for a refund if they cannot make it on the new date.
A bit like the cyber attacks, right? It's not if, it's about when. But yeah.
Ghonche mentioned, yeah.
All right. Well, have a good day, everybody, and thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers, Ryan.
So much.
Yeah, bye.